This video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. After John Carpenter's Halloween ignited the slasher genre to intense popularity, everyone and their mother wanted a piece of the pie. Sure, the slasher genre wasn't anything new at that point. In fact, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho is universally credited as one of the pioneering slasher films in American cinema that practically kickstarted a whole new trend for the horror genre. The thing was, slasher movies had a unique selling point, which was that they were able to capture the intimate paranoia and moral panic of the everyday setting being intruded upon by an outsider or unseen danger and blah blah blah. You've heard this all before. In short, the slasher genre brought horror into a tangible reality. It was something that could actually happen. It was a believable contrast to the creature feature era that came before it, and today we sort of take it for granted how visceral and provocative slasher movies once were because they are virtually everywhere at this point. So much so that our culture is completely desensitized to it, especially when there are scarier things happening in the news. Okay, but this is all common horror cinema babble, but it's interesting how the 80s, being considered one of, if not the best decades in horror cinema, a statement I wholeheartedly disagree with, brought horror to the mainstream more than ever before, despite the growing concerns towards violence in the media. By the start of the 80s, most horror was about developing and expanding upon existing concepts, before the 90s became about blatantly ripping them off. Except we got to that sudden shift thanks to the rise of hyperbolic pop culture that basically trended towards wanting what was essentially more of the same. By the end of the 80s, the market kinda spoke for itself. Regurgitation was in its prime, and even today still carries itself with irregular intervals. But it's hard to pinpoint what exactly caused this trend to begin with since it's so subjective. Yet, being the pretentious a-hole that I am, I'm going to do it anyway, because being a YouTuber, I like to think I know everything. So let's talk about Friday the 13th. Originally, I planned on just doing a broad retrospective on this franchise, but 4 movies in, I gave up on the idea because, woohoo, talk about repetition! Friday the 13th is absolutely iconic. Jason Voorhees' murderous stalking rampage at Camp Crystal Lake is a treasure to horror cinema, but not the kind of treasure that's worth a fortune, more so it's the kind of treasure of like finding a sweet under the sofa or something like that. Friday the 13th is truly unadulterated, shameless slasher schlock. It jumps between unapologetic mean-spirited and delightfully fun, and what distinguishes it from many other slasher movies is that over time, you find yourself casually rooting for the villain. Regardless of how intentional this may have been, Jason is indirectly lovable for just wanting to kill without remorse. He's sort of like the careless younger brother to Michael Myers, in that while Myers was this brooding force of evil, Jason is just relentless for being built like a shit brick house. For all the sass I'm giving this franchise, it knows exactly what it is, and doesn't ever try to be anything more than the definitive example of films that just go for sensationalist crowd-pleasing glory kills, and if you've ever played the recent game, its creatively gruesome kills are its proper USP. Effectively, Friday the 13th arguably helped kickstart the trend towards flashy kill counts as opposed to genuine attempts at horror from a psychological point of view, accentuated by an eerie, brooding atmosphere that really sells how menacing and unpredictable the presence of Jason could be. Really, at worst, it was somewhat the first of many films that capitalized on lowest common denominator gore candy, but at the same time, bar the sternness of the first film, it always seemed more rooted in being a fun, if indeed creepy breather, from all the commentary and intellectualism that started emerging within the genre in greater numbers. But before we go any further, why not see Jason's victims as a cautionary tale as to why you should protect yourself at all costs, like from all the maliciously dangerous threats of the online world. That's why this video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. Granted, this will not protect you from Jason Voorhees. A VPN is a virtual private network that masks your IP address and encrypts your data when you're online, so it prevents anyone from tracking you when you're doing things like shopping or handling personal information that you don't want unknowing eyes to see or steal. But personally speaking, I like using it to get access to a better quality selection on Netflix because the UK one is absolutely terrible. It's as simple as downloading the app for your phone, tablet, browser, or games console, selecting a cheeky wee country if you're choosing, click connect, and bam! Ain't nobody preying on me today. ExpressVPN is less than $7 a month with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you try it out and it's not really your thing, don't worry, they will give you a full refund. There is no risk whatsoever, so why not take back your internet privacy today with ExpressVPN and find out how you can get 3 months free by clicking the link in the description box, expressvpn.com/Ryan. So yeah, let's get back to talking about Friday the 13th. Considering the number of times I've referenced Wes Craven and his efforts to reinvent the horror genre on several occasions, or using it as a means to explore themes surrounding morality and human depravity that were practically copy and pasted into later horror films, let's turn our attention to the producer of his infamous classic The Last House on the Left, Sean S. Cunningham. Cunningham may not be a household name to mainstream audiences, but he had a noticeable impact on the genre and became a cult figure for many. I mean, he only directed one movie that I recognized. What's Terminal Invasion? Oh, I definitely need to see that. Anyway, I kinda like to see Cunningham to horror what J.J. Abrams is to Hollywood, in that he surrounds himself with many people who revolutionized or pioneered certain aspects of cinema, gained credibility as an admirable producer, but never made anything that lived outside the shadow of his influences. Cunningham has one major claim to fame, and that's Friday the 13th, or as it was once described before its iconic cult status in later years, the little movie that desperately wanted to be the next Halloween. Even though Halloween wasn't exactly a critical darling at the time either. I know I sound like a cynical douchebag because I am, but that's besides the point, yet Friday the 13th was somewhat the main instigator to the independent slasher movie craze, and it could be argued that the model it introduced of producing low-budget, low-risk audience-pandering horror flicks was pretty influential in later years. So here's the thing, the first film wasn't just about some crazed serial killer fueled by pure evil and nothing more. It was actually a killer fueled somewhat by love in the form of vengeance. It's no spoiler to say that the original Friday the 13th isn't about Jason, the infamous antagonist of the series who went on to define much of its pop culture appeal, and this actually makes for an interesting piece of trivia to later generations because, well, the twist where it's revealed that it was Jason's mother Pamela this entire time is even more effective to people coming late into the franchise who are only familiar with Jason. Hell, Scream even made a reference to this cultural misconception in the opening of that film, which was conveniently directed by Cunningham's buddy Wes Craven of all people. Jason didn't become the killer until the sequel, and didn't obtain his iconic hockey mask until part 3, so considering what we know of the franchise's legacy today, it makes the first film indirectly more impactful. Even more so, it was actually thanks to VFX and makeup artist Tom Savini that we even got Jason to begin with, where his decaying corpse emerges in the final moments of the movie to attack the final girl, Alice, who awakens in hospital paranoid that Jason is still out there. For a franchise debut, it's a powerful conclusion where all the tragedy behind Jason and his mother's vengeance is met with supernatural unfinished business. The story of Pamela's son Jason drowning in the camp lake while the counsellors were too busy banging each other was in itself a play on the popular trope that emerged from the slasher genre at the time, that being the symbolic relationship between sex and death. While, funnily enough, I feel it was Wes Craven who did this greater justice in Nightmare on Elm Street a few years later by calling more direct attention to the trope as a core aspect of its story, Friday the 13th was pretty archetypical of the concept, where it was usually the virgin final girl who made it to the end, while those who indulge in the sinful evils of lust doomed themselves to a terrible fate. It's a weird trope for sure that's better exemplified elsewhere, but it at least introduced the element of innocence in that an innocent child dies as a result of teens looking to, embrace adulthood while neglecting the responsibility that comes along with it. Mrs. Voorhees thus represents that overprotective parent who scorns teens and their disgusting antics, despite having probably indulged in the same actions in her time. Oh, but things were different back then, and now we have to protect the children because the hippie counterculture is trying to overthrow middle-class conservative values. Oh no. Now, the original screenwriter Victor Miller was openly dismissive of the sequels for basically squandering the themes and core idea behind Friday the 13th. In his words, the film was about manipulating our common expectations of the killer, where Jason was the real victim of the story, not the villain that the sequels make him out to be. Unless of course you're like me and part of the generation that only cares about Jason's kill streak. After all, there really isn't anything more to the story than simply subverting certain slasher conventions, like having the mother be the real threat. That kinda has a somewhat satirical quality to it when you think about the cultural pressure at the time. Hell, it would actually hold up even more so today in a society of batshit insane parents, but I digress. Narratively speaking, the sequels just make no goddamn sense. It's bad enough that the story is completely overshadowed by a massive black plot hole that is, why do we have an adult Jason running about when he died as a kid? And don't pull the whole, well, given how ambiguous the first film ends, maybe he grew up. Well, it's not exactly set in the f***ing future now, is it? Except Jason X. While the first film was the only truly committed mature horror story in the series, the sequels did start off with enough seriousness to capitalize on shock value that was becoming an increasing concern for media detesters and critics who thought it was being tasteless and sending out the wrong message to people, because the excitement of violence ultimately outweighed emotional attachment to the film's victims. Yes, they did get goofier, and I'm pretty sure they deliberately started going out of their way to reject the moral thematics of horror, but the first film, despite confronting accountability for the death of a child, wasn't exactly constructive either when it was still a film carried by the pure act of a gratifying murder spree. While critics kept disregarding the franchise as just lowbrow sensationalism, that's exactly what Friday the 13th did so well. It was a celebration of chaos that you would have to have a stick up your ass if you found it offensive. The producers knew exactly what they were selling to their audience. Jason was the inadvertent hero of the story. He's the villain you want to root for, and not just because of the terrible trend of shitty protagonists that cultivated later slasher movies. Like I said in my Freddy vs. Jason video, that movie had the self-awareness to recognize that there is a sympathetic quality inherent to Jason because he was aggressively bullied and drowned as a result of negligence. As Miller said, he is the tragic victim. So despite Miller's insistence that the sequels ignore the symbolism behind him, you could say the fanbase helped project Jason as a subversive anti-hero that's already rooted in a genre's symbolic play on sex and violence somehow going hand in hand. When you think about it, it's actually the same crisis the Saw franchise went through. Here's a genuinely artful, compelling murder mystery that went on to make its money on our morbid curiosity to see traps play out. Imagine if the traps failed in the Saw sequels. Let's be honest, it would be kinda anticlimactic because it's less about expectation and more about anticipation. If people don't get what they came for, they feel robbed. That's where desensitization comes from. It strips itself of complexity to give you the fundamental experience of the genre in question without emotional disruption, regardless of how artful or thought-provoking it is. It's the same way comedy can exist just to give you jokes, or the way action can exist just to give you thrills. It's about leisurely appeal, not about changing your life like some films try to be. It's a celebration of visual splendor. It engages less with the left-thinking side of your brain and allows you to escape into the imaginative right side of it. Friday the 13th was an event before it became standard practice today. It was purely theatrical and played on the unification of pop culture in that it was something that brought fans together. Cunningham himself even admitted that he wasn't proud that the only reason audiences flocked to see the films was because of the violence, but really, what other reason would we have for people to indulge in over-the-top horror? It helped break down a stigma to enjoying the pure madness of horror cinema. In fact, the stigma became so much for its creators that they actually tried to end it to find respect in other projects, but that didn't end so well. For all these videos where I talk about thematics and meaning in horror and how it can help us understand and cope in a weird, crazy world like this, it's franchises like this that give us a detachment that's needed from this world. Escapism is highly underrated these days. Sure, we still get plenty of indulgent antics, but in the realm of horror, we sometimes forget that it's not always about being scared. Horror is just as fun and exciting as any other genre. Hell, the Friday the 13th franchise more or less went the route of following the action cinema formula, giving Jason crazier scenarios that eventually led to an abrupt end when the box office returns lessened. With all these horror reboots, many of which are actually finding success, there's definitely a place reserved for Jason's return. In fact, there's an empty void in the genre that I'm sure many of us would like to see him fill once again. When you think about all the creative, bizarre, superhuman slasher flicks that came after it, they're all emblematic of what Friday the 13th was for the genre. It toyed with our dark, twisted curiosity to see a side of life that, outside the context of its exaggerated fiction, was a far too disturbing reminder of what reality can ultimately be. Hey folks, thank you so much for watching. Let me know your favourite Friday the 13th film in the comments below. Personally speaking, my favourite is Jason X. I just think it's wildly entertaining, silly and stupid and weird, and I think it kind of captures the essence of what that franchise became, which I know for a lot of people is a bad thing because a lot of people do prefer the sort of serious, stern version of Jason, which I think the 2009 remake actually did a pretty decent job with. But it was kind of generic in other ways. It just sort of didn't have that, you know, memorable touch to it, you could say. So hopefully they'll get that lawsuit sorted so we can get more Jason films, hopefully good ones though, speaking. And yeah, until next time, follow me on Twitter and Instagram, and if you enjoyed this show and you enjoy what I do here, why not consider supporting it on Patreon as well? But regardless, stay very, very safe, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye!